Fable Sync presents The Invisible Gateway by Ari. Chapter 1. The Unseen Path. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when young Thomas Adler stumbled upon the door. The kind of door that didn't quite belong, as if it had materialized from nowhere, hidden beneath the thick vines of ivy that had long since claimed their place on the forgotten wall. The world around him was awash in golden hues, the trees whispering in the wind, the air cool and refreshing. Yet Thomas felt an unsettling sense of wonder bubbling in him. It was his first glimpse of something truly out of place. Thomas had always been an inquisitive child, with an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond what the adults would tell him. But it wasn't until he turned 13 that he began to notice how often the world concealed its mysteries behind ordinary facades. At that age, he was still innocent enough to believe that the world held secrets meant to be uncovered. And it was that youthful sense of adventure that led him to the secluded corner of the old city where the wall stood. He had been walking home from school, his mind preoccupied with the ordinary matters of a 13-year-old, his friends, his schoolwork, his dreams of becoming a writer. He had taken the long way home that afternoon, drawn to the winding alleys and cobbled streets that held the fragrance of history. His feet carried him down the path he had never noticed before, a narrow passage wedged between two ancient stone buildings that leaned toward one another as though in a secret embrace. The wall, high and thick, loomed in front of him. It had always been there, an unmoving sentinel that separated the bustling city from something else. The thing was, Thomas could not remember ever seeing the wall this close before. It was just as he was admiring the intricate carvings of ivy and moss that he noticed something strange. Half hidden within the dense foliage was the door. The door had no handle, no visible lock, and was crafted of aged wood that seemed to have been touched by time itself. It was small, not large enough for an adult to pass through with ease, but just the right size for a child. Its edges shimmered with a faint golden light, a subtle glow that beckoned to him in a way he couldn't explain. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cool surface. It felt strangely warm to the touch, as though the door itself was alive, breathing in sync with his pulse. His heart raced, and he could hear his own breath, shallow and quick. He had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, and yet, in that moment, the world seemed to pause. "Thomas." The voice was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't the voice of his mother, nor his father, nor anyone else he had ever known. It was distant and unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting, as though it were calling to him from a faraway place, a place he could not yet comprehend. The door, if it could even be called that, beckoned once more. Before he could think better of it, Thomas pushed. The door opened with surprising ease, its hinges silent despite its age. And there, on the other side, was a world unlike any he had ever seen before. It was a vast meadow, bathed in the soft glow of a setting sun. The sky painted in shades of amber and violet. The air smelled of flowers and earth, a fragrance that seemed to soothe him, wrapping him in an unseen embrace. Trees dotted the horizon, their branches bending under the weight of strange fruits that shimmered like jewels. A stream trickled nearby, its waters sparkling with an ethereal glow. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect. And in the center of it all, a figure stood waiting for him. She was a woman, tall and graceful, with long flowing hair that seemed to ripple like the wind. Her clothes were simple, yet elegant, and her eyes, those eyes, were the color of the deepest blue, as if they held the secrets of the universe within them. "Thomas," she said, her voice musical, like a melody carried by the wind. "Welcome." Thomas could hardly speak. His thoughts were a tangled mess, his heart pounding in his chest. Where am I?" he stammered. "You are where you are meant to be," she replied. "This place is for you, Thomas. For you and for those who are willing to seek the truth." The words made no sense to him, but there was something in the way she spoke them that made him feel as though he had always known them. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand what was happening, but the questions stuck in his throat. The woman smiled gently, as though reading his mind. "This is only the beginning," she said, "but you must choose. The door is always open, but it only leads to what you are willing to seek. If you choose to stay, You must be ready for the journey ahead. 1,000 questions flooded Thomas's mind, but one rose above them all. What is this place? The woman's eyes gleamed with a mysterious light. This place is the world beyond the wall. It is a place where your heart can truly see, where your soul can truly be. But remember, not all that is revealed is meant to be understood. And just like that, Thomas felt the weight of her words settle over him. He was standing at the threshold of something vast and unknown, something that could change him forever. The door had opened, and now it was up to him whether he would walk through it. The world beyond the wall awaited him, a world where the rules of the ordinary no longer applied, a world where every step could reveal something new, something deeper. But was he ready? Chapter 2. The Choice. Thomas stood at the threshold, the soft glow of the world beyond the door casting an otherworldly light on his face. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of distant flowers and something else, a subtle hint of adventure, of the unknown. He felt the pull, a magnetic force urging him forward, but something held him back. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears as his eyes flickered between the world before him and the life he knew behind the door. The woman, whose name he did not yet know, watched him silently, her expression unreadable, but there was warmth in her gaze, a quiet encouragement. It was as if she knew the questions swirling in his mind, and yet she offered no answers, only the promise of the journey ahead. "Thomas," she said again, her voice like the soothing melody of a lullaby, "you must choose. The door is open, but only you can decide if you will walk through it." His breath caught in his throat. But how do I know what's beyond? What if it's not what I think it is? What if I make the wrong choice? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words carefully. The choice is never wrong, Thomas. It is simply a step in a journey. You may not know where the path will lead, but you will learn along the way. There is no turning back once you step through. But think of it this way. By staying in the world you know, you are choosing to remain the same, to live within the confines of what is familiar. But if you step through this door, you are choosing to change, to discover something greater, something deeper. The world beyond is full of truths that may frighten you, but also full of wisdom that will guide you. Thomas's mind raced. He glanced back at the door behind him, the familiar path of cobblestone streets, his home, his school, the life he had always known. It seemed so distant now, like another world entirely. Here, at the threshold of this strange, glowing place, the possibilities felt endless, but so did the uncertainties. He swallowed hard, the weight of the decision heavy on his young shoulders. He thought of his parents. What would they say if he simply disappeared? What would his friends think? Would they even believe him if he told them? A part of him wanted to return to the safety of the life he knew, to the comfort of routine, but another part, the part that had always yearned for something more, was calling him forward. "What happens if I don't go through?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, as if he feared the answer. The woman smiled softly, as though she had anticipated the question. "You will stay where you are. Your life will continue, but it will be as it was before. You will grow older, perhaps wiser, but the world will remain the same. There will be no more doors, no more hidden paths. The journey you seek will remain out of reach." Her words lingered in the air, and Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. There it was, the crux of the matter. If he stayed, nothing would change. But if he left, he might discover something far beyond his imagination. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The woman's presence was strangely calming, as though she knew the doubts swirling in his mind, knew the fear that gripped his heart. Yet, she said nothing more. She simply waited, as though giving him the space to make the decision for himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thomas stepped forward. The sound of his footfall seemed too loud in the quiet, the soft thud of his shoes against the earth echoing in his ears. With each step, the world behind him seemed to fade further away, as if the door was not just a physical barrier but a boundary between two worlds, and once crossed, there would be no return. As his foot crossed the threshold, the air around him seemed to hum with energy, a deep, resonant vibration that made his skin tingle. He could feel the change in the air, the shift in the very atmosphere, as though the world he had known was slipping away. The soft glow of the meadow seemed to grow brighter, the colors more vivid, the scents more intoxicating. He had stepped into another realm, a place where time and space felt different, a place where everything seemed to be alive in a way he could not yet understand. The woman stood beside him now, her smile gentle, her eyes filled with something beyond wisdom, something deeper, as if she had seen countless others stand at this very spot, making the same choice. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have made your choice, Thomas," she said. "The journey begins now. But remember, this world is not as it seems. It is a place where you must look beyond the surface, where the answers you seek will not be given easily. The door you pass through will always be here, but it is the journey you choose that will shape who you become." Thomas nodded, though he didn't fully understand her words. His mind was spinning, caught in the whirlwind of this new world he had stepped into. But there was no turning back now. He had crossed the threshold, and he would face whatever lay ahead. The woman stepped aside, gesturing for him to follow. "Come," she said, her voice still as soothing as ever. "There is much for you to discover, and the first step is always the hardest." With that, Thomas took his first step deeper into the meadow, his heart pounding in his chest, and the world beyond the door unfolding before him. Chapter 3. The world unfolds. As Thomas walked further into the meadow, the world around him seemed to transform with every step. The path before him was a gentle slope, winding through tall grass that shimmered like a sea of emerald beneath the fading light of the sun. Flowers bloomed in every color imaginable, their petals delicate and soft, reaching out as if they were eager to share their beauty. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and lavender, was crisp and invigorating. The breeze, though gentle, carried with it a sense of purpose, as if it, too, was guiding him towards something far greater. The woman, whose presence felt like a quiet, constant reminder of the journey ahead, walked beside him. She moved with a grace that seemed to make her part of the very fabric of the landscape, as if the earth itself knew her and welcomed her with open arms. Thomas couldn't help but feel both small and important in her presence, as though he were a thread woven into a tapestry far beyond his comprehension. "You must wonder where we are," she said, her voice still as melodic as before, "and why you are here." Thomas nodded, the question that had been gnawing at the back of his mind for so long finally breaking free. "I don't understand. Why me? Why am I here in this strange place? And what am I supposed to do now?" The woman smiled, her eyes gleaming with that same ancient understanding, but there was no pity in her gaze, only kindness and patience. The why is a question many ask, Thomas, but the answer is not always simple. Sometimes the why comes later, after you have walked far enough to understand. But what matters most now is what you choose to do with this moment. The choice to step through the door was only the beginning. What happens next is up to you. Thomas thought about her words as they continued their journey through the meadow. The path eventually led them to a small stream that sparkled like liquid silver. The water flowed gently, its surface reflecting the sky above, clear, deep, and endless. He bent down to touch it, his fingers skimming the cool surface. As he did, he felt a strange warmth radiate from the water, almost as if it recognized his touch. "The stream," the woman said, "is not like others. It holds the memories of those who have come before you. It carries their stories, their choices, and their journeys. If you listen carefully, you can hear them." Thomas looked at her, confused. "You mean, if I listen to the water, I'll hear their voices?" She nodded. "In a way. The water is not just a reflection of the world around you. It is a reflection of the soul, of all that has been and all that could be. Those who walk the path you have chosen leave their mark here. Every choice, every step, ripples through time, and those ripples gather in places like this." Thomas was silent for a moment, contemplating her words. He could hear the sound of the water, the gentle rush of it as it moved over the smooth stones. He closed his eyes, and for the briefest of moments, he felt something, an echo, a whisper from the past. It wasn't a voice he could understand, but it was there, alive, in the very fabric of the world around him. The sensation was fleeting, like a dream that vanished as soon as you tried to hold on to it. "Do you hear it?" the woman asked, her voice soft as she observed him. "The call of those who have walked before you? The ones who faced the unknown, just as you are doing now?" Thomas nodded slowly, feeling both awe and trepidation. There was something undeniably powerful about this place. A place where the boundaries between the past and the present seemed to blur, where every step could lead him to a deeper understanding of himself and the world. "Why does it feel like they're speaking to me?" he asked. The woman's smile deepened. "Because they are, Thomas. The journey you are on is not just about discovering new places. It is about discovering the parts of yourself that have been hidden. The choices you make here will uncover pieces of who you are, of who you can become. You will see reflections of yourself in the stories of others, and you will learn from them." Thomas stood up, the sense of mystery and wonder growing within him. The stream before him, though quiet, held more than just water. It held something far greater, the potential to understand, to grow, and to see the world with new eyes. As they moved on from the stream, the landscape shifted again. The vibrant meadow gave way to a dense forest, its trees towering above them like silent guardians, their branches twisted and gnarled. The air grew cooler, the shadows longer. There was a deep stillness here, a quiet that seemed to vibrate with ancient energy. The woman stopped at the edge of the forest, turning to face him. Her eyes glimmered with a knowing expression. "This is the Threshold Forest, Thomas. It is a place where the unknown becomes tangible. The paths here are not always clear, but if you listen closely, the answers will reveal themselves." Thomas looked ahead at the forest, feeling a mixture of excitement and fear. He had crossed the meadow, touched the stream, and now, standing before this ancient wood, he knew there was no turning back. The door behind him was long gone, swallowed by the shadows of the world he had left behind. He stepped forward, the forest swallowing the last rays of sunlight as he entered the unknown. The journey had truly begun. Chapter 4. The Threshold Forest. As Thomas stepped into the forest, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, mingled with a faint, almost imperceptible fragrance of moss and old wood. The towering trees loomed overhead, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. But there was no real sound, no bird call, no insect hum, just the quiet, endless whisper of the forest itself. The woman walked beside him, her presence a steady guide. But now her steps were more measured, as if she, too, were attuned to the subtle changes in the air. Thomas could feel a shift, like the ground beneath his feet had grown more uncertain, as if the very earth were alive, shifting in response to their presence. "Why is it so quiet here?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper as he looked around, his eyes scanning the dense underbrush and the thick canopies above. The shadows seemed to deepen with every step he took, and the further they went into the forest, the more the world seemed to close in on him. It was as if the trees themselves were watching him, waiting for something. "This is the place of thresholds, Thomas," the woman said, her tone far more serious now. "The Threshold Forest is not a place to be crossed lightly. It is a liminal space, a place between worlds, where the rules of the familiar no longer apply. Here, you will face the choices that will shape your journey. What you find in this forest will test you, will challenge everything you think you know. But it is here that you will learn the truths that lie deep within you." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. Every step he took seemed to pull him deeper into the unknown. The forest felt ancient, filled with secrets buried within its roots and leaves. There was something about this place, something unsettling and profound. The silence that surrounded them was thick, like it was waiting for something to happen, but Thomas didn't know what. They walked for what felt like hours, though no time could be measured here. The trees seemed endless, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as though they had grown in defiance of time itself. Strange patterns began to form in the bark of some of the trees, symbols, shapes that seemed to shift when he looked at them too long. They seemed almost familiar, like images from his dreams, but whenever he tried to focus on them, they dissolved into the forest's deep shadows. Suddenly, the woman stopped, her eyes narrowing as she gazed ahead, her face unreadable. Thomas followed her gaze, but all he saw was a dense wall of foliage. At first, it seemed like nothing more than another part of the forest, but as his gaze lingered, he realized something was different. In the center of the thicket, there was a gap, a break in the trees that formed a perfect arch. The arch was not made of wood or vines, but of shimmering light, like a doorway woven from the very essence of the forest itself. It was not solid, but transparent, as though it were made of mist, yet its presence was undeniable. The woman turned to Thomas. "This is the first of many choices you will face, Thomas. Beyond this arch lies a truth that you are not yet ready to face. But it will reveal something about you, about who you truly are, not just who you think you are." Thomas hesitated, his heart pounding. The arch called to him, but there was something in the air that made him feel unsure, something that whispered in the back of his mind that he wasn't ready. The light from the arch seemed to beckon him, but at the same time, he felt the pull of the forest around him, urging him to stay, to wait, to continue walking the path he was on. "I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "What is beyond the arch? What am I supposed to do?" The woman's gaze softened, her eyes locking with his. "You will never fully understand until you step through. The truth you seek is not a simple one, Thomas. It is a truth that will challenge everything you have known, everything you have believed about yourself. But you must make the choice, and you must do so without fear." She stepped forward, her feet barely making a sound on the forest floor, and Thomas felt an undeniable pull to follow her. But his feet remained planted, rooted in the earth, as though something deeper inside him was holding him back. "Is it a test?" he asked, his voice small. She nodded. "Every step you take in this forest is a test, but it is not the kind you might think. The tests are not external, but internal. They will ask you to look inside yourself, to face the fears and doubts that have shaped you. Beyond this arch lies the first of those tests." Thomas's mind raced, the weight of her words pressing down on him like an unseen hand. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the choice before him. But still, the arch seemed to call to him, as though it were part of him, as though crossing it would answer questions he hadn't even known he had. He stepped forward tentatively, his breath shallow. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to step back, to stay within the safety of the forest's embrace. But his curiosity, his desire to understand, pushed him forward. The woman's voice was soft as she spoke again. "Remember, Thomas, nothing here is what it seems. The arch will reveal what you need to see, not what you expect. Step through only when you are ready to face the truth." Thomas reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the edge of the arch. The moment his fingers brushed the light, a sudden surge of energy coursed through his body, as though the very essence of the forest had wrapped around him, pulling him toward the unknown. With a deep breath, he stepped through the arch. Chapter 5. The Mirror of Truth. The moment Thomas crossed the threshold of the shimmering arch, he felt a jolt, a sharp, almost electric sensation that made his skin prickle and his heart race. He staggered slightly but quickly regained his balance, looking around to find himself in a place unlike anything he had ever seen. The forest had vanished completely, replaced by an open expanse of mist, an endless void stretching in every direction. The ground beneath him was soft and yielding, like walking on thick, silken clouds. The air here was heavy, thick with an almost tangible sense of expectation, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The woman was no longer beside him, and for the first time since they had met, Thomas was utterly alone. He called out her name, but his voice seemed to vanish as soon as it left his lips, swallowed by the silence of the mist. His gaze flicked around nervously, the feeling of isolation creeping in like a cold shadow. It was as if the very nature of this place defied all sense of time and space, a place suspended in the unknown, where the rules that governed the world no longer applied. Then, out of the thickening fog, a shape began to materialize. It was a large, full-length mirror, its silver frame intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to move in the light. The mirror's surface shimmered, rippling like water in a storm. Thomas felt a pull toward it, an inexplicable urge to step closer, though part of him was afraid of what he might find. He hesitated, his breath shallow, his heart pounding. What would he see? What could this mirror show him? The question gnawed at his mind, but he couldn't turn away. He took a tentative step toward the mirror, then another, until he stood directly before it, his reflection slowly coming into focus. At first, it was just his face staring back at him, but as his gaze shifted, the reflection seemed to shift too. The world inside the mirror was no longer just a simple reflection of Thomas. It began to morph and distort, showing him scenes that seemed to stretch beyond time and space. The first image that emerged was of his childhood, his small self running through the yard of a house he hadn't thought of in years. The grass beneath his feet, the bright blue sky overhead, his parents laughing together as they watched him play. Everything seemed so vivid, so real, like a memory plucked from the past and made tangible before his eyes. It was beautiful, comforting, and yet, something about it felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the moment seemed frozen in time, as if he were looking at a version of his past that wasn't quite right, that had been edited somehow, altered for reasons he couldn't understand. Then the reflection shifted again, showing him another moment, another part of his life. This time, it was his teenage years, his struggles with school, his isolation from his peers, the feeling of not fitting in, of being on the outside looking in. He saw himself sitting alone at lunch, his eyes downcast as he stared at the empty seat across from him. The image felt sharp, painful, and Thomas felt the familiar sting of that loneliness again, as if he were reliving the moment. But the pain was not just in the image, it was in the very air around him. The mist grew heavier, more oppressive. Thomas felt the weight of his past, the regrets, the things he had never truly dealt with. The mirror seemed to pull these memories to the surface, not to allow him to forget them, but to confront them. "Is this it?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. "Is this what I'm supposed to see?" But the mirror didn't answer. It only showed him more moments of his life, more reflections of choices he had made. There was the time he had hurt someone he loved, a mistake that had haunted him for years. There was the path he had taken to escape the pressure, to retreat into himself rather than face the consequences of his actions. And there, in the depths of the mirror, he saw his own fear, a fear of failure, of rejection, of never being enough. The reflection then shifted again, and for a moment, everything went dark. Thomas blinked, his heart racing, but when the light returned, he saw something entirely new. An image of himself standing before the mirror, looking directly at his own reflection. But this time, his expression was different. It was not filled with regret, guilt, or fear. Instead, he saw a version of himself that was at peace, a version of himself that had accepted the past, forgiven the mistakes, and chosen to move forward. The image of peace seemed to radiate a soft, golden light, and Thomas felt a wave of warmth wash over him, something he hadn't felt in years. This version of himself was calm, centered, and strong. It was as though the mirror was showing him not just what had been, but what could be. "Who am I?" Thomas asked aloud, his voice full of wonder. "What am I supposed to be?" The reflection in the mirror smiled, but it wasn't just Thomas smiling. It was the very essence of what he could become, his potential to rise above the past and embrace the future with open arms. For a long moment, Thomas stood there, staring into the mirror. The weight of the memories that had once burdened him felt lighter now, less suffocating. He was seeing himself, not through the lens of fear or regret, but as he truly was, as he was meant to be. But the mirror held one last image. It was a shadowy figure, not quite human, but familiar nonetheless. It was the version of himself he feared the most, the person who had been too afraid to try, too lost in self-doubt, the person who had walked away from his own potential. The figure stood in the background, barely visible, lurking just out of sight. "Do not forget," the woman's voice suddenly whispered in his mind, "the choices you make here, in this place, will shape who you become. The past may have shaped you, but it does not define you. The future is yours to create." The mist around him began to thin, and the figure in the mirror started to fade, becoming nothing more than a fleeting shadow, dissolving into the light. The peace he had seen in his own reflection grew stronger, more real. Thomas felt a sense of clarity that had been absent from his life for so long. The journey was not about fixing the past. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward. With a final, steady breath, Thomas turned away from the mirror, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the truth of his past, and though it was painful, it had shown him the way forward. And as he stepped away from the mirror, the mist began to clear, revealing the next part of his journey. The forest was waiting. Chapter 6. The Shifting Path. The moment Thomas turned away from the mirror, the mist seemed to lift, dissipating like smoke carried away by the wind. The forest reappeared around him, though it was no longer the same as it had been before. The trees, though familiar, now felt different, as if the very nature of the forest had shifted in response to the choices he had made. He stood at the edge of a narrow path, one he had not seen before, its entrance hidden among the thick trunks of the ancient trees. The light from the arch seemed to linger in the air, casting a soft glow on the ground ahead of him, highlighting the path that stretched into the heart of the forest. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his mind still heavy with the reflections he had witnessed. He had faced the truths of his past, the regrets and the fears that had haunted him, but now, with the mirror behind him, he was unsure of what lay ahead. What did the path mean? Where would it lead him? He glanced back, half expecting to see the mirror still hovering in the mist, but it was gone. The forest had swallowed it up, as if it had never been there at all. The silence that had surrounded him earlier had returned, but now it was no longer oppressive. Instead, it felt peaceful, as if the forest itself were waiting for him to continue. As he stood there, the woman appeared at the edge of the path, her figure emerging from the shadows like a ghost. She seemed unchanged, her presence as steady and calm as it had been when they first met. Her eyes met his, and without a word, she stepped aside, allowing him to move forward. "Where does the path lead?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "The path leads to you, Thomas," she answered simply. "It will take you to the next part of your journey, where the choices you make will define who you become." Thomas felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. "But I've seen what I need to see. What more is there for me to learn?" The woman's expression softened, her eyes filled with an understanding that seemed to reach deep into him. "The journey is not about knowledge, Thomas. It is about growth. Every step you take on this path will challenge you in ways you cannot yet understand. But it is through these challenges that you will find your true strength. It is through the choices you make that you will unlock the next door. The door to your future." The words resonated within him, but still, doubt lingered. The path before him felt uncertain, like it led into the unknown. What lay ahead? What did the next part of his journey hold? These questions circled in his mind, but as he looked at the woman, he realized she was not here to provide the answers. She was here to guide him, to remind him that the answers were already within himself. Thomas took a deep breath and stepped onto the path. The moment his foot touched the ground, the forest seemed to respond. The air grew warmer, the trees seemed to stretch higher, and the path ahead of him opened up wider, as if welcoming him forward. For the first time since entering the forest, Thomas felt the weight of his uncertainty begin to lift. The path, though still unknown, no longer seemed so daunting. It was a path he had to walk, and the only way to truly move forward was to take the first step. The forest was no longer a silent, oppressive place. As he walked, the sounds of life began to return. The rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the whisper of the wind through the trees. These sounds filled the air, creating a symphony that was both comforting and exhilarating. The forest was alive, but it was not a threatening kind of life. It was the kind of life that promised growth, change, and transformation. With every step, Thomas felt himself becoming more attuned to the world around him. His senses sharpened, and the landscape seemed to reveal itself in ways that were impossible before. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the forest, and with each turn, he felt as though he were being led somewhere important, somewhere that would reveal something about him that he had never known. After a while, the path began to narrow, the trees closing in around him, their branches arching overhead, forming a canopy that filtered the light into soft beams. It felt as though he was being guided, as if the very trees themselves were steering him forward. And then, as he rounded a bend, he saw it. The clearing ahead was bathed in soft, golden light, and in the center stood a stone pedestal. On the pedestal rested a small, intricately carved box, one that seemed to pulse with an energy that resonated deep within him. As Thomas stepped closer, his heart began to race. The box seemed familiar, though he had never seen it before. He could feel its significance, its power. It was as though this was the moment he had been waiting for, the culmination of his journey thus far. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the smooth surface of the box. The moment his skin made contact with it, a surge of energy coursed through him, a deep, resonant force that made his body hum with a power he couldn't explain. The box seemed to open on its own, revealing a small, glowing orb nestled inside. Without thinking, Thomas reached for the orb, his fingers wrapping around its warm surface. The moment he held it, the forest around him seemed to come alive in a new way. The trees swayed in rhythm with the pulse of the orb, and the air seemed to shimmer with energy. It was as though everything around him was connected, all of it flowing through the orb and into him. And then he heard a voice that seemed to echo from the very depths of the forest, deep and ancient, yet filled with an unexpected gentleness. "You have come far, Thomas," the voice said, "but the path you walk is only just beginning. The door you seek is not far from here, but it will require more from you than you have given so far. The truth you seek will not be handed to you. It will be earned. Only then will you understand what lies beyond the door." Thomas stood frozen, the orb glowing brightly in his hands. The voice was not the woman's, nor was it his own thoughts. It was something older, something wiser, and it filled him with both awe and trepidation. The path ahead had just become even more uncertain, but Thomas knew one thing for sure. He was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to unlock the next door. Chapter 7. The Challenge of the Mirror. The orb in Thomas's hands hummed with an energy that was both comforting and unsettling. Its warmth seeped into his skin, filling him with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He stood in the center of the clearing, feeling the weight of the forest around him, as though it were watching, waiting. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches almost brushing his shoulders, the soft whispers of the leaves mingling with the rhythmic pulse of the orb. The voice had faded, but its words lingered in the air, echoing in Thomas's mind. "The door you seek is not far from here, but it will require more from you than you have given so far." Thomas knew he had reached a pivotal moment. His journey through the forest had been filled with lessons, reflections, and revelations. But now, standing before the glowing orb and listening to the voice, he realized that the true test was yet to come. The door, the final destination, was still ahead of him, but the path would not be an easy one. The voice had warned him. It would require more from him. He looked down at the orb again. It seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, as though it had become a part of him. But how could it be the key to unlocking the next step? What more could it reveal? And what was the door he was meant to find? Just as these thoughts began to take root, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. It was subtle at first, like a slight vibration, but it quickly grew in intensity. The air around him shifted, as though something was moving within the very fabric of the forest. The trees groaned, their trunks creaking, their leaves rustling as if they were speaking to one another. Suddenly, from the center of the clearing, a mirror began to materialize, rising from the earth like a reflection of the world itself. It shimmered, its surface smooth and undisturbed, as though it had always been there, hidden beneath the forest floor, waiting for this moment. The mirror stood tall, its edges carved with intricate patterns that seemed to twist and change as Thomas gazed at them. He instinctively stepped back, holding the orb closer to his chest, as if it might somehow protect him from what was about to unfold. The mirror beckoned him with an almost magnetic pull, its surface gleaming in the soft light of the forest. A voice, this time softer and more familiar, whispered in the wind, "The door lies beyond this mirror, Thomas. But to pass through it, you must face what lies within yourself." Thomas's heart raced as he stared into the mirror. The reflection it presented was not his own, at least not entirely. He saw a younger version of himself, standing in the same clearing, but his expression was different. His face was filled with confusion, uncertainty, and a sense of lost potential. This version of himself was not the man he had become, but rather the man he had once been, a version of himself he had long forgotten or perhaps buried. The mirror shifted again, and the image changed. Now, he saw himself surrounded by shadows, his face twisted in pain and regret. He saw moments of his past that he had tried to erase, his failures, the mistakes he had made, the relationships he had ruined. It was as though the mirror had opened a window into his soul, revealing the darkest corners he had never dared to explore. Thomas's breath quickened. His hand tightened around the orb, and he felt a sudden surge of emotion rise within him. Fear, shame, anger, regret. He wanted to look away, to shut out the reflection, but the mirror held him captive, forcing him to confront everything he had been and everything he feared he might still be. But then, as the mirror's images continued to shift, a new figure appeared in the reflection. It was him again, but this time, he stood taller, more confident. His expression was resolute, no longer burdened by the weight of his past. He could see in his own eyes the strength he had gained from his journey, the wisdom he had earned through each step he had taken. This version of himself was not a perfect man, but he was someone who had learned from his mistakes, someone who had come to terms with his past and embraced the possibility of a better future. For the first time, Thomas felt a sense of peace. The mirror had shown him not just his flaws, but his growth. It had revealed the man he had become, the man he was meant to be. He understood now that the journey had not been about escaping his past, but about accepting it and using it to fuel his transformation. The voice spoke again, this time clearer and more soothing. To pass through the door, you must accept all parts of yourself, Thomas. The path you seek is not one of perfection, but of understanding. The door will only open when you are ready to accept both the light and the darkness within you. Thomas stood before the mirror, the orb now glowing brighter than ever in his hands. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The fear that had gripped him earlier began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. He had faced his past, confronted his fears, and embraced his growth. Now, it was time to move forward. With a final, steady breath, Thomas stepped toward the mirror, the orb still warm in his hands. As he touched the surface, the mirror rippled like water, its reflection fading into nothingness. He felt a surge of energy, as though the very fabric of the world around him was bending and shifting, ready to reveal the next step of his journey. The mirror was no longer a barrier. It was a passage, and Thomas was ready to walk through it. As he stepped forward, he felt the pull of the orb in his hands, guiding him, urging him onward. The world around him began to blur, the forest dissolving into light as he moved through the mirror, leaving behind the past and stepping into the unknown future that awaited him. The door was no longer a distant dream. It was now within his reach. Chapter 8. The Passage Beyond. The world around Thomas twisted like a ribbon caught in the wind. As he stepped through the mirror, the familiar forest vanished, replaced by a landscape that was entirely new, yet somehow still familiar. The air was thick with an ethereal glow, and the ground beneath his feet was soft and spongy, as if he were walking on clouds rather than solid earth. He looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The space he found himself in seemed to stretch endlessly, an open expanse that blended together in hues of gold, silver, and deep blue. The colors shifted constantly, like the changing phases of the sky at dusk, never settling, always in motion. In the distance, he could see a figure, standing alone. It was not the woman he had encountered in the forest, but someone else entirely. The figure was tall and cloaked in a flowing garment, their face hidden in the shadows of their hood. Despite the lack of detail, Thomas felt an undeniable connection to the figure, as if they were someone he had known all his life. The figure began to move, slowly, gracefully, as though gliding across the surreal landscape. Thomas, driven by an impulse he couldn't explain, started walking toward them. As he moved forward, he noticed the air around him seemed to hum, as though resonating with each step he took. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with life. Each breath he took felt deep and resonant, and the soft glow that bathed the landscape became more intense, enveloping him in a warmth that reached into his very bones. When he was only a few paces away from the cloaked figure, it turned to face him. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure's face was still hidden, but somehow he could feel its gaze. It was as if the figure could see right through him, past the layers of his thoughts and emotions, into the deepest recesses of his soul. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice low and melodic, echoing in the vast space. "You have crossed the threshold, Thomas. But do not think this passage is the end. It is only the beginning." Thomas's mouth went dry. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and fear. "I am the guide," the figure answered simply. "The one who walks with you through the next phase of your journey. I will show you what lies beyond the doors you seek, and help you understand what you must become." Thomas's thoughts swirled. "But I thought I had reached the door," he said, the confusion evident in his voice. "I thought I was ready." The figure's gaze softened, and for the first time, it stepped forward, lifting its hood to reveal a face that seemed both unfamiliar and strangely familiar. The face was ageless, with sharp features and eyes that glimmered with a depth of knowledge Thomas could not comprehend. There was no sign of age, no wrinkles or lines, but the eyes held the weight of countless lifetimes. The gaze that met his was full of empathy, yet there was a quiet power to it, as if the figure had seen the essence of the universe itself. "The door you seek is not a physical threshold," the figure said, their voice now tinged with a deeper wisdom. "It is a state of being. To walk through the door is not to pass from one place to another, but to understand the nature of what lies within you. You have already faced the mirror, Thomas, and seen the truths that dwell within you. But the next step requires you to move beyond those truths." Thomas stood still, trying to absorb the meaning of the words. "Beyond my truths? What does that mean?" The figure smiled gently, its expression warm yet distant. "It means understanding that who you are is not defined by what you have been, nor by what you have done. The past is a shadow, and the future is but a reflection of the choices you make in the present. You are not bound by your history, but by your ability to transform and embrace the unknown." Thomas's thoughts became a whirlpool. He had believed that the past had shaped him, that his actions and decisions, his regrets and fears, defined who he was. He had spent so much time looking back, trying to piece together the puzzle of his life, but the figure's words suggested something far more liberating, that his true identity was not found in his past, but in his capacity to move beyond it. As if reading his thoughts, the figure nodded. "The journey ahead is not about finding answers, Thomas. It is about embracing the questions. It is about stepping into the unknown and trusting that, even without all the answers, you will find your way. It is a path of discovery, not of certainty." Thomas felt a flicker of understanding, but it was still unclear. He had expected a clear path, a straightforward answer, but what the figure spoke of was far more profound. The answers he sought were not to be found in the external world, but within the very core of his being. "How do I move forward?" Thomas asked, his voice steady now, a new sense of determination taking root inside him. The figure lifted its hand, gesturing to the vast expanse that stretched before them. "You move forward by choosing. Choose to let go of the need for certainty. Choose to embrace the unknown, the uncertainty. The door you seek is not a place. It is a choice, and only you can make it." With those final words, the figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the air like mist carried away by the wind. The landscape around Thomas shimmered and shifted, becoming clearer, more defined. He was no longer standing in an ethereal, dreamlike world. The colors began to settle into shades of blue and green, the soft hum of energy fading into the sounds of distant water. The figure was gone, but its words lingered in the air, hanging over Thomas like a gentle breeze. "Choose," he whispered to himself. "Embrace the unknown." And for the first time in his journey, Thomas understood what he had to do. Without hesitation, he began to walk forward, his heart steady, his mind clear. The door that awaited him was not a physical threshold, but a state of being, a choice that he had to make for himself. The journey had only just begun, and the path ahead was wide open, ready for him to take the next step. Chapter 9. The Choice. Thomas walked through the now clear landscape, his footsteps firm against the soft ground, his mind still processing the words of the figure who had guided him. The air was thick with an energy that felt like a promise, one that both terrified and exhilarated him. The world around him seemed to pulse with life, each tree, each blade of grass, alive with purpose, as if everything in this place was waiting for him to make the next choice. He had learned so much already: the importance of accepting his past, the understanding that the door he sought was not a physical threshold but a state of being, a choice. But now, as he walked through this vibrant, shifting world, he realized that the true challenge lay in his next decision. He could no longer rely on the past or seek the answers that had once seemed so elusive. The only thing that remained was the choice to move forward. But what did it mean to move forward? His gaze drifted across the landscape, where colors continued to shift, the boundaries of the world seeming to blur at the edges. There was no clear path before him, no signposts guiding his way. This was not the familiar world he had known. It was a new realm, one that seemed both vast and intimate at once. Thomas stopped in his tracks. He had come so far, and yet he felt as if he stood at the edge of an abyss, unsure of how to take the next step. The choice that lay before him was not one he could simply make with logic or reason. It was not about choosing a destination or a goal. It was about embracing the unknown, stepping into the uncertainty with the faith that the path would reveal itself as he moved forward. The figure's voice echoed in his mind. Choose to embrace the unknown. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. His hands gripped the orb that had guided him this far, the warmth of its surface grounding him in the present moment. It was time to let go, to stop waiting for the right answer, the perfect path. It was time to trust in himself and in the journey that lay ahead. When he opened his eyes again, the landscape had shifted once more. Before him stood a vast field, filled with flowers of every color imaginable. They swayed gently in a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, yet filled the air with a sense of serenity. The beauty of the scene was almost overwhelming, as though the world itself was offering him a moment of peace before the final choice was made. At the far end of the field, a single tree stood, its branches reaching high into the sky, its leaves shimmering with a silver light. The tree was different from everything else in the landscape. It was not a part of the shifting, ethereal world, but something permanent, solid, and real. Thomas felt a sudden pull toward the tree, a sense of recognition that he couldn't explain. It was as if the tree represented the final choice, the moment when everything would come together. He began walking toward it, his pace steady, his mind clear. As he drew closer to the tree, he noticed that its trunk was marked with strange symbols, carvings that seemed to pulse with life. The symbols were not of any language he knew, yet they resonated with something deep within him. They spoke to him, not with words, but with feelings, images, and memories that swirled in his mind. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became. He knew that this tree, this moment, was the turning point. It was the final test, the choice he had to make to move beyond everything he had known, to embrace the next phase of his journey. He stood before the tree, the orb now resting in his hands, its glow intensifying. He felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though all the answers he had been seeking were contained within this moment. He was ready, more than ever before, to make the choice, to step into the unknown. And then, without hesitation, Thomas placed the orb gently against the trunk of the tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the symbols on the tree began to glow, their light spreading across the trunk, filling the air with a soft, golden hue. The ground beneath Thomas's feet trembled slightly, and the air grew thick with anticipation. The tree shifted, its branches bending and twisting, as if acknowledging the presence of the orb. A doorway, barely visible before, began to open within the trunk. It was not a traditional door, but a passage, an entrance into something vast and beyond comprehension. The light from the tree grew brighter, the energy around it swirling and crackling with power. Thomas took a step forward, drawn to the passage. This was the moment, the final choice. He stood before the opening, knowing that once he entered, there would be no turning back. There would be no more questions, no more searching. Only the journey forward, into the unknown. Taking a deep breath, Thomas stepped through the doorway. The world around him shifted, dissolving into a swirl of colors and light. The passage was not a physical space, but a transformation, a crossing from one state of being to another. As he moved through it, he felt his very essence being reshaped, redefined, as if the journey had not just been about finding a destination, but about becoming something new. The doorway closed behind him, and for a moment, Thomas was suspended in nothingness. He felt no fear, no doubt, just peace. He was no longer bound by the past or the limitations of his previous self. He had made his choice, and in that choice he found freedom. Chapter 10. The Revelation. The sensation of movement was almost imperceptible at first, a gentle shift in space, as though the very fabric of reality were bending and reshaping itself. Thomas felt as though he were floating, untethered from all that had once defined him. There was no time here, no sense of past or future. He was suspended in a timeless, formless space, yet it felt as though every part of him was being fully awakened, aware, and alive. As the swirling colors and lights began to settle, Thomas found himself standing once more, but this time, the surroundings were unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was as if he had transcended the physical world, entering a place that existed beyond the limitations of the senses. The space around him was vast, filled with endless light and sound. Yet neither of those elements had a clear source. They simply existed, blending together in a harmonious dance, an eternal symphony that seemed to flow through his very being. There was no sky, no earth beneath his feet, only an expansive void that hummed with energy, like the pulse of the universe itself. And then, slowly, a figure began to materialize before him. At first, it was little more than a flicker of light, a shifting shape that seemed to form and unform as if caught between worlds. But as it came into focus, Thomas could make out the familiar outline of the figure he had met before, the guide. The same presence, the same wisdom in their eyes, yet somehow different now, more expansive, more infinite. "You have crossed the threshold," the guide's voice echoed, soft yet powerful, reverberating through the space around them. "And now, you are ready to understand." Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him, a peace so deep it reached to the very core of his soul. There were no questions in his mind now, only a quiet acceptance. The journey had led him here, to this moment of truth. He was no longer searching. He no longer needed to understand everything, for somehow, he knew he already did. The guide spoke again, their words resonating with profound clarity. "This place, this space you stand in, is beyond time. It is beyond form. It is the space between all things, the place where all potential resides, the still point where everything begins and ends. Here, you are not bound by the rules of the world you once knew. Here, you are free to become whatever you choose." Thomas felt the weight of the words settle in his chest, each one a seed planted deep within him. He realized then that this journey had not been about finding answers, nor about solving the mysteries of his life. It had been about discovering the freedom to shape his own destiny, to step beyond the constraints of his past and embrace the boundless possibilities that lay before him. "You see, Thomas," the guide continued, "the door you sought was never an object. It was always within you. It is the door to your true self, the self that exists beyond your fears, your doubts, your limitations. It is the self that is free to explore, to grow, to transform." For the first time in his journey, Thomas understood. The door had never been a destination. It had always been a choice to be true to himself, to embrace the unknown with courage and faith. The guide had not shown him the way. They had simply reminded him of the power that lay dormant within him all along. The guide's figure began to dissolve once more, its form dissipating into the light that surrounded them. But before they completely vanished, they spoke one last time. "Remember, Thomas, the journey is not about the destination. It is about the freedom to choose, to evolve, and to trust in the process. You are the creator of your own path, and the door you seek will always be with you. For it is not a door at all, but a way of being. With those final words, the guide was gone, leaving Thomas standing alone in the vast, endless expanse. He felt a deep, profound shift within himself, a transformation that went beyond understanding. It was as if the very essence of who he was had been redefined, no longer confined by the limits of time, space, or the past. He was free, free to choose, free to create, free to be. And in that freedom, Thomas realized something he had not understood before. The journey was not something to be completed. It was something to be lived. The space around him began to shimmer and fade, as if the reality he had entered was dissolving. But this time, Thomas was not afraid. He knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. The journey had no end, only endless possibilities. As the light enveloped him once more, Thomas stepped forward, knowing that he was no longer searching for a door. He had become the door himself, the threshold between all possibilities, the keeper of his own destiny. And so, he stepped into the unknown with a heart full of hope and a spirit of endless potential, ready for whatever the journey ahead would bring. The door had been opened, and Thomas was free.